Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon, Dan Proft on another edition of Illinois Rising. Joining me today is John Tillman, President and CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute, illinoispolicy.org. And John, this week, a lot of news being made by Tiny Dancer, as I like to call him. And now I've popularized that description of Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, including the unveiling of his fiscal year budget.
Things are getting better all the time. Just a $2 billion tax hike on the people of Chicago at a time when they're already abandoning the city in record numbers and everything. You know, we're following the Detroit model, Dan.
Not $2 billion. We got to break this down because there's a lot of exciting and different ways that Rahm is proposing that he and the city council extract people's money from them. 30-cent increase on the tax for ride-sharing services like Uber, Lyft.
Right.
Taxis also have to pay that 50% tax, so that's a 30-cent increase in the tax, so up from 20 cents to 50 cents. Right. Ride-sharing companies can now pick up at O'Hare and Midway airports and McCormick Place, but will have to pay a $5 fee for every drop-off and pick-up at those locations, as well as at Navy Pier. Which is why, you know how you do this, though. If you just put yourself in a different location, just walk out.
I was just going to say, I cannot wait for the stories that are going to come out at McCormick Place of the people who, like a block away from McCormick, there'll be a line of Uber people waiting, and the Chicago police are going to come by and harass them.
Yeah, it's not too difficult to outsmart the tax collectors at City Hall, it turns out. But also, we've got the...
yes, mostly by moving, by the way.
Well,
that's the ultimate outsmarting.
Boy, no, you... telling me as a Chicago resident, you're out there in the leafy suburbs.
Yes,
Also, we've got to tax those e-cigarettes for the kids.
Speaking of suburbs, don't you think a lot of these people in the city might now go out to the suburbs to buy that?
Yeah, right, sure. I mean, it's the same thing they do with cigarettes, right? The arbitrage county lines or, frankly, state lines. Go to Northwest Indiana. And then, of course, a highlight that $500 million property tax increase.
They call it $500 million. It's actually about $2 billion over 4 years. And the way they tried to portray it is they only talked about the increase on an annual basis. They didn't talk about the accumulated increase over time. So as is typically the case when they want to reach into your wallet, they try to hide just how deeply they're going into your pack of 20s.
Well, let's go into our Wayback Machine and remind ourselves what Rahm Emanuel had to say on election night in 2011 when he was the newly minted mayor of Chicago with the vision for what he was going to do in his first term as mayor of Chicago to confront the challenges facing the city.
And we need to confront a budget deficit that threatens our future, not by burdening Chicago families with more taxes they cannot afford, but by reinventing city government so city government works for the taxpayers.
Now, he was still going through puberty at the time, apparently. I forgot how high his voice used to be. It's kind of strange. But is that what he has done? Confronted budget deficits and relieved the burdens on Chicago families?
Well, he said taxpayers there, and I think it's important to learn how this works in the Democratic political machine. He does want to relieve the burden on Chicago taxpayers, those who are in the unions, those who work for the city, the county, the state. That's whose burden he is relieving, and he is transferring that burden onto private sector taxpayers who are now going to pay for the ongoing pension benefits, salaries, and all the rest of it that are no longer affordable.
Now, this past Tuesday, when he unveiled his budget, it struck a bit of a different tone. I had a bit of a different rap. Is
his voice deeper?
And we're going to find out right now. Here's what he had to say about his 2016 budget with all those tax increases you just described.
Raising property taxes is a last resort. It is why we have never increased them in the last 4 years. But we must solve the pension challenge we inherited, and there are only two options. We can make the damaging cuts that I just outlined and reverse all the hard work and progress that we made. Or we can raise property taxes to meet our obligation to police and firefighters who answer our every call.
Yeah, no, I mean, we certainly don't want to cut anything.
Here's what I think is interesting about this, Dan, is typical of the political class, and I think the Emanuel's approval numbers now way underwater, 50% disapproval, 25% approval, and he just got reelected with 56% of the vote. So it just makes you wonder who these people are. Did you pay attention back in April when you had a chance to vote? But here's what I think is interesting that he said about the 2016 budget. Raising city property taxes is the last resort. It is why we have never increased them with that clip we just heard. But down here he says we only have two options. We can make the damaging cuts or we can raise taxes.
Right.
He has no imagination that there's a third or a fourth or a fifth way. And, of course, what we talk about, what you talk about on the show every week, what we talk about at the Illinois Policy Institute, is there are many other ways to do it. He views these options as the Detroit options, raise taxes or damaging cuts. And we saw what happened in Detroit. It didn't work out too good. There are other things you could do, which is have government workers share in the pain. And he doesn't seem to want to do that.
Well, and right, just kind of restructuring the costs that government throws off onto taxpayers. I mean, essentially what you're saying. So the kind of the structural reform, starting with pensions. I mean, the other thing, too, is this is very much like his rap during the election. How are you going to deal with the financial distress the city of Chicago finds itself in? Well, I'm going to get a casino.
Right. And the city's going to own it. That shouldn't be a problem at all. Having the city own the
right. And when's that going to? First of all, how much is it going to generate? When's it going to happen? You don't snap your fingers and all of a sudden you have a casino. Secondly, Governor Rauner's going to broaden the sales tax base. So it was always kind of looking for a version of a Springfield bailout to do the heavy lifting. He was never interested in structural reform, even though that's what he was touted. This is a tough guy, because he beats his chest a lot and he uses profanity. So that means he's tough and he's going to make tough decisions. It's incredible to me how naive people are in Chicago, particularly the captains of industry in Chicago who've supported this guy twice now. From the beginning and to the present, except this week, Crane's had an interesting piece where some of these business leaders, C-suite execs downtown, who've supported Rahm financially and every other way, all of a sudden they're crying foul. Well, wait a second, he's not as pro-business as I thought he would. Well, heavens to Betsy, it turns out that Rahm Emanuel is a progressive Paul who's interested in, singularly interested in his own political power and his own political advancement. And if that means he needs to tear your business asunder, he needs to walk away from who he said he was going to be as it pertains to your interests, he has no problem doing that.
No, in fact, I think what's interesting about it is back when Rahm first came out of the scene was going to run, as you and I had this debate all the time about whether Chicago Republicans, business leaders, should support him
right.
at the same time they're supporting Republicans for governor or president or whatever. We always thought that was a little bit bizarre. And my answer always was, well, Rahm's the best of those he was running against, and I still believe that is true. It's a little frightening now that we see that record, right? So if he was the best, and this is what we're getting, pretty amazing. But what I think is interesting, the argument I always made was, I get why they might want to be sort of neutral to friendly to Rahm, but why strengthen his hand? Why give him money? Why help him build political power, which reduces their leverage with him down the road? So he's entrenched now. They have no leverage with him, and suddenly, as you point out, it's not going so well.
Well, and that's it, too. And, I mean, think about why strengthen him. Now think about the re-election. I mean, not to relitigate the whole 2015 campaign, but think about that. This was always curious to me, my question to center-right voters who didn't like Rahm but said, well, he's the best of a bunch of bad options. Well, wait a second. Do you want you're saying that all of the people running are opponents of what you believe and the policy choices you would like to see made. Okay. So do you want to select the person with the most power and the most capacity to advance policies that are against your interests, or someone like Chuy Garcia who has less capacity? And oh, by the way, since we're talking about this in a larger political context, are you going to be excited when Rahm Emanuel, the guy you're supporting, the guy you're financing, then turns his sights after this election to, say, for example, Mark Kirk, to take a Senate seat away that you don't want taken away too? The myopic thinking from people who are otherwise wildly successful in their chosen pursuits and then kind of want to engage in civic life and more than just having their name in the Goodman Theater roster. It's incredible to me, and it's so frustrating.
Well, and what I think is interesting is the counter argument they would make to the argument you just made. The counter argument they made was, well, if we allow somebody like Chuy or whoever to get in,
right.
They will be subsumed by the power of the unions and the power of the aldermen who are captured by the unions. Well, that's where we are now.
Yeah, Chuy he would have raised property taxes. Oh. He would have imposed a commuter tax. Right. Cigarette taxes. and on and on and on.
When I was asked about Rahm at the beginning, I always said, I think Rahm, and this is how naive I was, right? I said, well, I think if anybody's going to fix the city of Chicago, it's going to be Rahm because he wants to be president. He thinks he can become president by, fixing Chicago. So therefore, he has to take on the public sector unions in the city of Chicago, because that's what you have to do to fix it. I guess he doesn't want to be president.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about this too, thinking about the numbers here, $30 billion unfunded police and fire pension liability. I mean, so this is not going to resolve those issues, especially
not
if
even close.
Right. Particularly, forget even it just looking at it statically, right? Just looking at it statically, it's insufficient. Now think about the obligations that continue to accrue on a real-time basis while you're trying to just kind of keep up with your minimum monthly payment. This is silliness. It's a fraud.
And it is a fraud. And of course, it's a fraud that's been going on for decades. But now what's different is that the public knows it's a fraud. What I think is interesting about this proposal is nobody in the engaged public believes it's going to fix the problem. Everybody knows it's just a game to sort of Band-Aid it over until Rahm's done being mayor and let somebody else deal with the carnage and bloodshed.